Welcome to Compelling Topics, the only channel dedicated to the perspective of leading researchers from the Italian independent scene. Let's turn your minds on. In this episode, we move into subtler territory where photographs, often dismissed as weak evidence or mere suggestion, become instead a starting point for reflecting on how we construct doubt, belief, and skepticism. Every image of alleged alien entities, every anecdote shared by witnesses, is not presented as a truth to be accepted, but as a trace. A trace that speaks not only about the phenomenon itself, but about us, about what we are willing to believe, what we reject a priori, and how cultural context shapes our perception of the unknown. Do not expect answers to old questions, expect new questions. The third episode of the series dedicated to Valmalenco opens with a tone distinct from the previous ones. After addressing UFO sightings in the first chapter and alleged alien entities in the second, Marco Radius immediately clarifies that this episode ventures onto even more unstable ground: the boundary between the physical and the paraphysical, between what can be photographed and what seems to manifest only fleetingly, escaping every reassuring definition. Alongside Andrea Dalbin, who provided and safeguarded all the documentary material, Maurizio Rucco also enters the scene, a member of the observation team who frequented the valley for years. The evening being discussed was not a planned investigative outing, but an informal, almost domestic gathering held at the home of Alessandro Di Roio, a Carabinieri marshal and a central figure in the entire Valmalenco case. This very detail makes the account even more unsettling. It was not a UFO hunting scenario, but a dinner among friends, ending in a completely ordinary way. And it is precisely in this relaxed atmosphere that something unexpected occurs. One of Alessandro's children, an 8 or 9-year-old boy, picks up a small digital camera, a 12-megapixel Nikon compact, and begins taking photos with no particular intention. Only later, while reviewing the images, does a detail emerge that radically changes the perception of the evening. In a seemingly ordinary photo, Andrea seen from behind, Alessandro in the background, a luminous circular shape appears in the upper right corner, a classic orb, at least at first glance. But inside that sphere, when the image is enlarged, a face is clearly visible. This is not a vague suggestion or an ambiguous stain. The figure shows coherent proportions, shadows around the eyes, and light reflecting off what appears to be skin. The more the image is enlarged, the more defined the details become, completely contrary to what normally happens with digital photography. A technical anomaly that alone would be enough to raise serious questions. The group searches for rational explanations, reflections, dust particles, pareidolia, double exposure. But none of these hypotheses truly holds. There were no people in the house who could correspond to that face. Those present were few and clearly identifiable. The child who took the photos had neither the means nor the motive to stage anything. And above all, the original image was always under control. Andrea took the camera and the memory card that same evening, leaving no time whatsoever for manipulation. A second photograph, taken just minutes later, deepens the mystery. In a spot where an empty coat hanger had clearly been visible before, a humanoid figure now appears, with even more evident features: a face, a head covering, something resembling a garment. Again, the lighting is consistent with the environment. Light enters from a side window and casts real shadows. This is not something ethereal or blurred. It seems to occupy a precise space. At this point, Andrea admits a crucial turning point. Until then, his research had focused on classic ufological phenomena: lights in the sky, moving objects, distant presences. But these images open a conceptual fracture. We are no longer talking about aliens in the traditional sense, but about entities that seem to manifest through photography, as if interacting with frequencies invisible to the human eye. An evening that began with no expectations thus becomes the turning point of the entire Valmalenco investigation, not only because the images are difficult to explain, but because they occur in an ordinary, familiar context, far removed from any sensationalistic scenario. And it is precisely this normality that makes the mystery even more unsettling. If such manifestations can occur while chatting after dinner, then perhaps the line separating the visible from the invisible is far thinner than we are willing to admit. Andrea feels the need to pause, to explain fully why that symbol and that photograph represented such a profound personal turning point for him. He says he can only imagine how it appears from the outside, but he is curious to hear Mauricio's perspective as well. Before that, however, he adds a fundamental detail which, in his view, gives even greater weight to what has been described so far. Andrea openly confirms what Maurizio has already stated. He had absolutely no knowledge of the symbol Maurizio carried with him, the triquetra. And, even more importantly, Maurizio could not have known Andrea either. The meeting took place on January 14th in Chiesa in Valmalenco, in the middle of winter. This is not a seaside location, but a mountain town with extremely cold temperatures. Everyone was fully bundled up, layered against the cold. No one could see necklaces, pendants, or symbols hidden beneath clothing. And yet, right above Mauricio's head, in a photograph, that symbol clearly appears. Andrea adds that even if it had been summertime and the pendant had been visible, the issue would not change in the slightest. The point is not that someone might have seen the symbol, but that it is imprinted in a photograph, inside an orb, exactly above Mauricio's head. This is not something that can be mentally constructed or deliberately projected. It is not a subjective vision. No one sees it with the naked eye. The symbol emerges only afterward, when the photographs are developed and carefully examined. And this, according to Andrea, is what makes the episode extraordinary. It is not a matter of suggestion or altered perception, but of information that manifests exclusively through the photographic medium. Andrea further notes that this symbolism is not random. These are extremely ancient symbols, recurring across multiple archaic cultures. This opens an enormous range of questions. In ancient times, when such symbols were considered sacred, perhaps there were other ways of seeing or perceiving them. Today we have technology. Perhaps then there were different systems, other forms of access to these manifestations. Maurizio intervenes, clarifying that, in his view, this is not merely about visualization. His interpretation goes in a different direction. The Celtic symbol, the triquetra, is not just an image. It is linked to a form of ancient knowledge, something we might today call magic, but which was actually a system of interaction with the ecosystem, with everything around us. From his perspective, in the past, there were individuals with particular gifts, people born with specific sensitivities, with bodies and spirits suited to certain roles. Symbols were operational tools, not decorations. A kind of command language, as we might say today when talking about computers. They were traced on the ground, in the air, painted on bodies to produce specific effects. Each symbol had a precise function. Over time, however, their meaning was lost, transformed, emptied. History books do not tell this story, but Maurizio speaks from direct experience, from lived interactions with this symbolic language. For him, these signs are a form of machine language, a way to resonate with the system that surrounds us. Marco Radius observes that anyone who follows the channel knows how often official history appears incomplete, if not in need of complete rewriting. On this point, he says, they are pushing on an open door. The discussion then moves to other images. In a subsequent photograph, two faces appear, perhaps three. Andrea clarifies that the faces are two. The third is merely a play of light and shadow without definition. But the two faces within the orbs are unmistakably clear. Again, despite accusations of falsification, Andrea assures that analyses were conducted, that the original SIM card is available, and that no trace of manipulation was found. In fact, something paradoxical occurs. While the rest of the image becomes grainy and loses definition when enlarged, the faces inside the orb become increasingly sharp. From a logical and technical standpoint, Andrea admits he cannot explain this. Pixels should degrade, not improve. And yet, the opposite happens. That night, there was darkness around them. The luminescence visible in the photo was not perceptible to the naked eye. The flash may have amplified something, but the environment was dark. And yet there was a sensation that something was around them, not visible, but perceptible. Maurizio recounts a feeling of being observed, but without fear. And here a fundamental detail comes into play: the animals. Alessandro's dogs. One in particular was joyful, serene, almost celebratory, wandering calmly. Another, larger one, was running and playing. This behavior conveyed calm. Maurizio explains that, in anomalous situations, he always observes animals, because they are far more sensitive than humans. Their serenity deeply reassured him. The focus then shifts to another orb containing a very precise geometric form. Andrea explains that after discovering the triquetra and the flower of life, he began investigating other symbols. This led him to the quadruple knot, a Norse symbol. He shows an example, and the resemblance is perfect. Its meaning is powerful. The interweaving of the universe, the idea that everything is connected, even when it is not immediately apparent. This is not a random symbol. It is not placed there by chance. Like the triquetra above Maurizio, it appears with a precise meaning. First the faces, then the symbols, an alternation that destabilizes anyone attempting to rationalize. Andrea recounts that after that night, he remains awake for days. It is an emotional shock. His perspective changes radically. Everything he does in the following years stems from that moment. He has the feeling that the evening was dedicated to them, as if someone wanted to use them as messengers. Maurizio confirms that that night was a turning point for both of them. He speaks of witnessing Andrea's metamorphosis, from someone entirely focused on UFOs in the sky, to someone who, after that evening, begins studying complex texts, Icelandic mysticism, Norse mythology, ancient languages. His life changes. His direction changes. Maurizio himself feels an inner push toward knowledge, toward movement. He starts over, abandoning the arrogance of having understood, and embarks on new paths. Years later, during the pandemic, he realizes that without the journey that began that night, he might not have withstood what he experienced while working in a hospital. They both agree on one thing. For anyone unwilling to limit themselves to a life of routine, sooner or later a night arrives, an event, a fracture, that changes everything. Not because the world changes, but because we do. And as more images scroll by, featuring new symbols, the sensation becomes clear. That night in Valmalenco was not merely a photographic anomaly. It was a beginning. After that image, after the face and the message that already seemed to contain everything, Andrea pauses for a moment. He says sincerely that, at first glance, there is not much more to add to that photograph. It is enigmatic, yes, but above all perfectly coherent with what was unfolding during that evening. An evening he describes as marked by a precise rhythm, almost a cadence. Symbols, then images, then symbols again. As if something were alternating different languages to communicate. The images shown are not the only photographs taken. On the contrary, they are part of a long sequence. But these are the ones that stand out, because they contain something within them. Faces, signs, forms that should not be there. Andrea recalls that in the previous episode they had already anticipated one of these images, the face. And he feels the need to clarify this for those who did not follow the first episode. That photograph was taken in a place where, directly in front of them, there was absolutely nothing. No visible light. No presence perceptible to the naked eye. All the luminosity that appears in the shot was not seen at the moment it was taken. And yet it is there, unmistakable. Andrea explains that he simply increased the contrast slightly to make it more readable, but the face is clear. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. This is not pareidolia. The form is too defined. As before, it is unclear whether the figure is wearing a hood or something similar. But the expression immediately stands out. The face appears to be smiling. And it is precisely this detail that ties back to what Maurizio had described earlier. The dogs were calm. No agitation, no fear. And indeed, Andrea says, none of these manifestations ever conveyed negative sensations, neither at the time nor later when reviewing the photographs. There is, of course, the adrenaline of the unknown, the anticipation that something might happen, but there is never a perception of threat. And this, according to Andrea, is also evident in the images themselves. That face does not communicate hostility. He openly defines it as smiling. He cannot say what it is. He openly states that it belongs to frequencies different from ours. There is no point in circling around that. The real question is another. Why choose to manifest in this way? Why imprint oneself inside an ordinary camera, an inexpensive one at that, an old Nikon with just a few megapixels, bought secondhand? Andrea also indirectly responds to those in the comments who suggest using professional equipment worth thousands of euros. He explains that the vast majority of these photographs were taken with very simple cameras, costing only a few dozen euros. And this brings the discussion back to the central point. It is not so much the technology that captures the phenomenon, but a kind of attunement, a matter of frequencies, perhaps energetic, something that, at a certain point, decides to interact. At this stage, Marco Radius draws attention to a detail he himself remembers clearly. In the lower left corner of the photograph, another orb appears. Andrea explains that, in this case, he inverted the colors to make it more visible. Inside that orb, something immediately appears anomalous. Marco recounts that when Andrea first showed him this image, he was literally shocked. His reaction was immediate. This is Morse code. Dots and dashes. A clear sequence. Andrea confirms this. He tried decoding it by overlaying the Morse code system. The message that emerges is unequivocal. Ave Avoi. Hail to you. Not only is the face smiling, it is also greeting. The greeting strikes both of them. Ave is not just any word. It is a formal, solemn greeting, historically reserved for figures of importance. Marco reflects on the contrast with our casual ciao, which originally meant, I am your servant. Here, instead, there is a high, respectful greeting. Addressed to whom? Perhaps to the person taking the photograph, perhaps to the marshal, or perhaps to you in the plural. Andrea leans toward this interpretation. The images seem almost distributed, as if each were intended for someone. One resonates more with him, another with Maurizio, another with Alessandro, as if there were a personalized yet shared communication. There were no further contacts, no other forms of direct communication. All the messages are there, imprinted in the photographs. And Andrea admits that, over time, he has processed all of this. But he invites listeners to imagine what it meant to live through it within a few hours, that night. To be thrown into images that alter one's perception of reality, to stop sleeping, to look around without understanding what is happening. Marco asks Maurizio how he experienced that night, whether he felt fear, discomfort, insomnia. Maurizio answers calmly. No, he says. No fear. Only a profound desire for knowledge. A need to move, to seek the keys to interpret what had happened. For him, those photographs are messages, information, received by each person in a different way, but with a precise effect, setting something in motion. Not everyone reacts the same way. What Andrea experienced is his own, subjective. The same applies to Maurizio. But in both cases, there are no negative emotions, only a push, a charge, a transformation. Marco concludes that, for him, this remains one of the most extraordinary images ever shown on the channel, perhaps the most extraordinary of all, because he has always believed more in shared testimony than in a single photograph. But here, there is both. And above all, there is a message. A contact between worlds, through images, symbols, and different languages, Morse, Celtic, Latin, not to demonstrate superiority, but to communicate, to leave information. And, as all three agree, that night in Valmalenco was not an answer. It was a turning point, a key moment. One of those events that, like a marriage, a birth, or a loss, marks a life. A propellant, something that sets you in motion. At this point, attention returns once again to the image. Marco observes the detail that strikes him most, a form that seems to overlap the face, almost like writing, or perhaps a symbol, something that crosses the image and at the same time completes it. Andrea nods. He too notices how that trace seems to frame the face, almost crowning it, and how above it there are recurring elements, figures that repeat, arranged in a surprisingly equidistant way. Andrea recounts having looked at that photograph dozens of times. The more he observes it, the more it gives him the impression of a face imprinted on an ancient coin, an effigy out of time. But he immediately clarifies that attempting to rationally explain images like these risks becoming a sterile exercise. In his view, when faced with manifestations that do not belong to our logical framework, the only sensible path is to allow ourselves to be crossed by what we feel. The sensations that emerge are personal, intimate, and precisely for that reason, authentic. Forcing a rational explanation in a world that insists on being only rational ultimately leads to disorientation. These images, Andrea says, destabilize, and that is understandable. But if one pauses, if one observes them calmly and attentively, what one feels may be exactly the message these figures convey. Not technical information, not evidence to be displayed, but something that reaches deeper. Maurizio intervenes, saying he could not have explained it better. He goes straight to the heart of the matter, emotion, in its pure, etymological sense. Something that moves you, and that movement is life itself. Without emotion, life would become mechanical, robotic. These symbols, these images, are meant to stir something inside. Obsessively searching for the technological structure behind, everything risks being pointless. What truly matters is what one receives. Marco agrees. He says that focusing solely on technical analysis is a waste of energy. Far more important is understanding what these images evoke. Then he invites them to move on, because there are more photographs to observe. A new image appears, taken at night. In the background, there is a full moon, and in the upper right corner, another orb appears. Inside it, once again, a face. But this time, something is different. Andrea explains that he deliberately chose this photograph because, unlike the others, the face is not human. The eyes are clearly different. Some have spoken of a gray, others still of a reptilian entity. Interpretations have been varied. The only certainty, Andrea says, is that it is not a human face. Beyond that, everyone is free to draw their own conclusions. Andrea reflects on the fact that some have tried to frame these images within a dreamlike or esoteric dimension linked to the deceased. But even this, in his view, does not exclude anything. It could all be part of a single whole. He returns to the symbol seen at the beginning, the one suggesting that everything is connected to everything. For this reason, he feels no need to assign a positive or negative polarity to that face. Dualities, for him, are of limited value. Everyone is free to interpret what they see, but one fact remains evident. It is not a human face. The discussion continues. Andrea shows another photograph, one of his favorites, taken by Alessandro. He openly says he is in love with it. There are two orbs, a red one on the left and a larger one toward the center. He reminds viewers that this was in 2013. He has seen the originals, conducted analyses, and those images are unexplainable. He then connects everything back to the evening in 2016, when they too obtained photographs with incredibly detailed faces. One in particular stands out for its definition. The more it is enlarged, the higher the quality becomes. It does not lose detail. Pixels, variations in brightness, the orb fading and turning red, and from within, a gaze emerges. A gaze that seems to be observing another orb. Andrea pauses. He says he could talk about it for hours, but does not want to overwhelm. He does, however, introduce a surprising connection. That image recalls one of the most astonishing crop circles of the past 50 years, which appeared on July 17, 1991, in Barbury, Wiltshire. A complex design, rich in detail, and within the orb appears exactly the same pattern. The question arises spontaneously: are we dealing with the same energy? Maurizio replies that, in his view, this is not a single phenomenon, but a set of different manifestations accumulating over time. And perhaps, he suggests, all of this happens around Andrea because he is a kind of catalyst, an unconscious magnetic center. He does not control what happens, but things happen around him. Marco expands on the idea: Andrea as a doorway, a portal between subtle and material levels. Perhaps an innate ability, perhaps something others could share, but rare. And Maurizio adds that it is not enough to go to Valmalenco to obtain results. Many have tried, and nothing happened. It is not automatic. Maurizio then shares a reflection matured over the years. There may be bodies with different talents, like different instruments for different souls. Andrea, in his view, has the talent of tuning into frequencies not perceived by the five senses, not to create spectacle, but to receive messages. And these messages are not meant to prove anything, but to prompt movement, inquiry, to break monotony. Marco emphasizes that the most important effect is not what happened to them, but what happens now to those who watch, the questions that will arise, the explorations that will follow with a different gaze. They arrive at the final image, a photograph from 2015, again taken by Alessandro. Andrea defines it as definitive proof of his role as a catalyst. He arrives, reaches out, takes the shot. An orb appears with a structure reminiscent of a solar system, an atom, something deeply symbolic. He does not know what it is. It remains an open question. Andrea concludes with a clear reflection: those seeking easy answers are on the wrong path. One must learn to ask the right questions, and he hopes that the audience, watching these images, will begin to ask different, deeper questions, not limited to true or false. Maurizio reiterates that they are not extraordinary people, but researchers, driven by the desire to understand. The evening they lived was a propellant, but what matters is trust in something greater. Marco closes by thanking everyone. He says they never intended to prove a truth, but to share a lived adventure, a journey that, paradoxically, led them from the futuristic to the most ancient. A journey that brought them together, allowed them to dialogue, and to grow. The closing is an invitation to sharing, to synergy, to communication. Because, as Marco reminds us, every failure is born from poor communication. And perhaps these images, above all, are precisely this, an attempt to communicate. We have seen controversial images, listened to accounts at the margins of the official narrative, and crossed stories that constantly oscillate between testimony, interpretation, and myth. But the real question is not whether those photographs truly depict something other. The point is to understand why certain images disturb us so deeply, why certain stories are ridiculed before they are even analyzed, and why the boundary between truth and fiction, in these cases, always seems so fragile. Perhaps the value of these stories lies not in their conclusion, but in their ability to crack certainties that have become too comfortable. Because doubt, when practiced honestly, is not weakness, it is an art.